Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sparrow Thought, the podcast for curious minds exploring creativity, culture, and stories from the margins. I'm your host, Tom Spare. In the previous episode, I reviewed the newest Spider-Man film, Spider-Man Brand New Day. You can find that wherever you found this episode. As it's the summer holidays, I'm running a pared back schedule for the show. So I'm putting out today's episode and then in the autumn, I'll be releasing a new series as well. Today's episode is actually taken from a session I delivered for the Be the Change media tour on the 16th of July. I didn't record the talk at the time, but the feedback from the audience was really positive. So I wanted to sort of re-record and share it here. And the focus of this episode is how do we tell ethical stories? Now, to start, I think it's really important that we focus on three things. What makes a good story? How do you tell it well? And how do you tell it responsibly? So this is not a sort of theory class on how to tell a good story. I want to give some practical examples for you. So this could be applied in your everyday work. This could be applied, for your essays or just in your everyday storytelling. And if you want to get into podcasting, into journalism more generally, every day we tell stories to our friends, to our loved ones, to our colleagues, and to ourselves. We make up myths every day. We add blemishes, a bit of color to the mundane. And why is that? Because humans were born to tell stories. The oldest piece of figurative cave art was discovered in 2014 in Indonesia. It's over 51,000 years old. So that's 51,000 years, around 630 lifetimes. We as a species have been drawing stuff on walls, on telling stories visually. Stories were no doubt being told long before then over campfires and in caves and other places. But the first story I want to talk about is my own. So I grew up in a town called Dover. I spent my formative years surrounded by a lot of history, a lot of bigotry, a small town on the decline, 22 miles from the French coast, a hard-edged white-cliffed border, and a sparkling sea. Europe was over there, and Dover's past was over here. I recently went back to Dover, up to the castle, a fortress that has stood on those white cliffs for nearly 2,000 years. The Romans built a pharos there, a lighthouse, a guide for the lost ships, and the Saxons, converted by the Romans, built a church to a single god, not the many of old. And the Normans added to the church, built a fortress of their own. English kings have built grand keeps, and over the centuries, every occupier, every owner has added a variation, an extension, a tower, more defenses, like a home inherited over the centuries. 80 acres, nearly 2,000 years of history. Now, the castle was used to plan the Dunkirk evacuations. An entire underground hospital was built there. The invasion of Italy was planned there in the Second World War, D-Day. And if the Cold War had turned nuclear, the regional government would have been based there too. I've been up to that place 10, maybe 20 times, and every time something is different. And from a young age, I was aware of my town's history, my town's story, my nation's story. And from that, I made my own chapters in my imagination, in my life, in my education, work, friendships, familial ties, and relationships. There will be, to paraphrase Rupert Brooke, a piece of me that is forever England. But for a long time, I thought I was British. Then I moved to Wales 12 years ago and realized I was very much English. And now I find myself identifying more and more as Welsh, Cymru and Biff, Wales forever. So that's my story. But what makes a really good story? Over the last 2 years, I've made over 100 podcast episodes. Together, the podcasts I produced, Sparrow Thought, which you're listening to now. Sparrow Thought is a largely solo effort with occasional guest co-presenters. And then also produced the Political Dispatch, which I've made with Lily, who's the CEO of the Be the Change Media Network, and our friend Sid. And, together, these two podcasts have been downloaded over 10,000 times. Each episode telling a different story, all based on the lives of real people, issues, organizations, and injustices. I could have picked from any one of those episodes that I've made, but for the benefit of this podcast, I've picked just 3. And to make things a little more straightforward, I'm going to pick from Spare a Thought in the first instance. Before I talk about those episodes, just a little bit of a refresher if you're new to this podcast. What is Spare a Thought? Spare a Thought is the podcast for curious minds exploring creativity, culture, and stories from the margins. Conversations that go to unexpected places, from the Welsh language and Japanese architecture to media ownership and the health of the nations. Now, originally, when I first launched the show back in October 2024, the show's focus was really on representation. So the podcast that shines a light on the people, issues, ideas, and organizations whose work often goes underreported or is misrepresented in the media. Why did representation matter at that point in time for me? Well, I learned during my MA in political communication at Cardiff School of Journalism, Media and Culture that 90% of British newspapers are owned by just 4 companies. And broadcast media, legacy news, they're following the same path. So some of you might have seen that Sky is purchasing ITV for £1.6 billion to create the UK's biggest commercial broadcaster. This media concentration results in media control. And who controls the media controls the story. And who controls the story controls reality, or their version of reality. In other words, the news we consume is made and is owned by some really powerful people. Edward Said, the great Palestinian and American academic, once said that news does not just happen. Pictures and ideas do not merely spring from reality into our minds. Truth is not directly available. Television, radio, and newspapers observe certain rules and conventions to get things across intelligibly. And it is these, more often, the reality being conveyed that shape the material delivered by the media. The news we watch, listen to, read is packaged, created, it is made. And we have to constantly ask ourselves, who is telling the story here? Who owns the publications that the news is being created from? Is everyone who the story is about actually featuring prominently? And it's not possible to cover every angle all of the time, every minute, every second of the day, 365 days a year. But making Spare a Thought is my own little way of reclaiming ownership of the news. I wanted to give a sort of casual 2 fingers up to the media concentration and tell stories that mattered. And I want to focus on 3 episodes of the show. So Spare a Thought for long COVID, Spare a Thought for paternity leave, and Curly's War. All brought lessons for the podcasting process, all personal to me in very different ways. So long COVID. On the 18th of March, 2025, I released Living with Long COVID. I interviewed and received testimonies from 12 long haulers, 12 individuals that had been living with long COVID. 12 completely different stories, all with a common thread of 3 factors. They had long COVID, support services had let them down, and society had moved on without them. Those 12 people, Lucinda, Vicky, Jackie, Eden, Amy, Tabitha, Yanto, Helen, Chris, Nicola, Mona, and Rachel, entrusted me with their stories. And here's Lucinda talking about living with long COVID and what we can do to help.
Hi, I'm Lucinda. I've been living with long COVID since August of 2020. Before I had long COVID, I was a student. I used to go to school 5 days a week, do rehearsals after school 3 times a week, go to theatre school on a Saturday, and do Girl Guides. I had a few friends, and after school, when I didn't have anything else to do, we used to hang out in the skate park or on the field next door to the school, and we'd eat snacks we bought and chat. I also used to play video games and sing. Since having long COVID, my life varies day to day. Some days I have enough energy to go to my online school and study, or do another hobby, and some days I'm in too much pain to even roll over in bed. I have to use a wheelchair to get outside of the house because I can't even walk to the end of my driveway, 5 years on, and I have to sleep in the kitchen because I haven't been able to climb the stairs since 2020. I'm also housebound, and I'm only able to go out for essential hospital appointments as going out causes me fatigue and pain. I have a few friends online, but I can't go out of the house with anyone but my parents, even down the road. I've had a few helpful health professionals, but most have been either gaslighting or just straight up dismissive and have never heard of long COVID at all. Even my long COVID clinic asked me if I was worried about viruses, despite being put where I am by a virus. People can help by not making fun of people, long COVID or not, for wearing a mask, and for allowing people space if they feel unwell or if they need to drop out of something at the last minute for the same reason. My message to the government is please stop shutting long COVID clinics. Stop hiding people with long COVID in the shadows and writing them off through NHS number manipulation or cutting social benefits like PIP and forcing them to go back to work, which has been proven to do much more harm than good. To the listeners, the pandemic is not over. Roughly 1 in 10 COVID infections cause long COVID, and that's without any associated organ damage or viral persistence in the body. Please wear a mask, a proper one like a N95 or a FFP2. Believe people in your life when they say they're sick or in pain. They're not lying about it. And advocate for clean air in indoor public spaces like schools through HEPA filters. Parliament has them, the World Economic Forum has them. So why don't our next generation of young people in schools and some of the sickest in our country have access to clean air? Make yourselves aware of long COVID, make others aware of long COVID, and let's make the world a safer place together.
At the time of recording, Lucinda was just 18 years old. She'd been living with long COVID for 5 years by that point. Every time I listen back to that clip, it really does bring me to tears. The suffering that Lucinda's faced, for her bravery and defiance, for the message she sends to listeners, and the injustice for all those still living with long COVID. There are a number of challenges in being entrusted with that responsibility. Firstly, there was a moral obligation to serve the people who had put their trust in me. Secondly, there was a personal connection. Thirdly, there was a technical challenge of weaving the stories together into something complete and coherent. Fourthly, there was the social justice angle. Those 12 people had been massively underserved and let down by wider society, by the state, by the healthcare system, by politicians, policymakers, and by the people of this country and globally as well. The response was incredible. So the episode got downloaded 230 times at a time, my second most listened to episode. It was the episode I received the most feedback from. People who had long COVID or had family members, people they cared about with long COVID, sort of reached out to me as well. And the episode that really moved others, most importantly, the people involved, were very pleased with the end result. I poured so much into that episode because it was a very personal topic, and I saw firsthand how disabling long COVID can be in everyday life. Just the small things can become really big. So I wanted to make the episode for them. They helped me source many of the contributors, shared call outs in WhatsApp groups, and I owe them a lot. They taught me what it's like to live in a society where disabled people have a really difficult time navigating the healthcare system, navigating education, the workplace. And we like to think as a country we look after disabled people. I don't think we do. And I think the episode proves it, to be honest with you. The lesson that I learned from putting this episode together is that, how do you ensure the ethical storytelling? I won the trust of people I was representing. I did the research. I heard from people who had long COVID that went on to then coach with people with long COVID. I included a campaigner for long COVID awareness. I had a good age range, but most of all, I wanted to represent the speakers fairly, starkly, and say as little to get in the way of that. I was a conduit, if you like, the person of privilege here. I used my privilege to tell other stories who didn't have the energy, the capacity, people exhausted by society that has, for the large part, forgotten them. So the first lesson of ethical storytelling is don't become the story yourself. Tread lightly. Check the people involved are happy with your work. Be their champion, be their ally. So that's the first part. That is living with long COVID. Now to the second episode. This is an episode that I reference quite a lot, actually, because it's I'm very proud of it in a very different way. So paternity leave. Back in the autumn of 2025, my friends Paul and Lucy had just become parents for the first time to Otis, little baby Otis. Otis is a cute little bundle of joy. We all love him very much. And I met him earlier this year. Paul had statutory paternity leave. His work were able to offer him some additional weeks, and he added annual leave on top of that. Now, one of the things you've got to think about with any sort of maternity, paternity leave is recovery time and how much physically the mum can do in the first few weeks after childbirth. think it's like presented in society, in Western culture in particular, that it's just expected to have kids and you sort of get on with it, which is quite a weird thing given how psychologically, physically demanding giving birth to a child is. Now, in 2024, 2025, 45% of all births were C-section. You can't drive or lift anything up to 6 weeks after that operation. And that's really challenging with bringing a little human into the world. And this got me thinking about like the practicalities of maternity and paternity leave. Paul and Lucy shared lots of stories about the Dad Shift, a campaign group looking to campaign for more paternity leave. So I sent the Dad Shift an email and I said, I've seen the Dad Shift pop up a few times on LinkedIn and elsewhere and would love to feature your organization on the podcast. So I'm putting together an episode focused on paternity rights and readiness for International Men's Day, which is November the 18th, with a release date planned for Tuesday, November 17th. Half an hour later, the co-founder of the Dad Shift, George Gabriel, replied to me via email. He was more than happy to help, and within a couple of days, he'd sent over some voice notes. Here's George explaining a bit more about himself and about the Dad Shift.
So for my day job, I work in social media. And I think as a result, I've had a front row seat to the rise of these kind of men and masculinity influencers, from Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan to Andrew Tate. And so I think I saw earlier and clearer than most the kind of warning signs, the sheer influence and reach that these figures were building, and the way they were shifting cultural attitudes really from millennials on down, in quite profound ways, and I had this sense that men from my generation and younger were slowly falling out of love with gender equality. And so the question I began asking myself is, well, how do you call them back? The hypothesis we hit on was that, maybe you could call men back to gender equality by campaigning on issues that were obviously pro-male, but also pro-equality. And that in so doing, you could, on the one hand, show up with additional kind of political capacity and muscle. So you wouldn't just be leaving these fights to the women's sector to fight on behalf of us all. But you could also, through campaigning in male voice, take the microphone back from some of those voices online and give a bit of an alternative portrayal of what it means to be a man in Britain today. And then me and my wife, we had our daughter. She arrived 2.5 years ago. And yeah, I was very lucky. I was one of a small number who get enhanced paternity leave. I had 4 months off from my employer. And that time was just incredibly important to me, to my wife, to my child. And so, yeah, I'd been struggling around trying to figure out, what could test this hypothesis. And there was a real moment of, aha, oh, it's paternity leave. Because I'm one of a tiny number who got that time off. And it was so clear that the current status quo was failing men, but also their families, and also society at large. So yeah, the Dad Shift is a campaign that we set up on the one hand to campaign for an improvement to the UK's statutory paternity leave, which at 2 weeks on less than half the minimum wage is the worst in Europe. But it's also an effort to explore whether we can begin to tell a different story about what it means to be a man in Britain today, one that is proudly and clearly compatible with gender equality.
So once I received those voice notes, I packaged the episode together, adding in voiceover to bridge in the clips, and I ended up with Spare a Thought for Paternity Leave. I released the episode for International Men's Day, and it remains one of the most listened to episodes on the podcast. So I have over 700 downloads, views, and listens. And just to put that into perspective, I'm sort of on about just over about 6,500 downloads now. So it's a really sizable chunk of my entire listens, which is great. About 12 minutes of audio from George, the rest of the episode narrated by me, about 2 hours of sort of putting the episode together. Sometimes it's not about the amount of time you put into something, it's the timing. It's when you put it out into the world, it's the organization or the guest who has the reach. It's also a bit of plain luck as well. I poured hours into making Living with Long COVID. I received just over 250 downloads, listens, and views. Not even half a day of work was put into the paternity leave episode. But also, I suppose the other element is I have those two examples, and we'll talk about the third in a bit. The Living with Long COVID episode was incredibly enriching, important, valuable to the people that it was representing. So it has a different type of weight to the paternity leave episode. Both of them issues that are really not talked about enough. And it's really worth supporting and following the Dad Shift. They put out some really great work, and I think, if we get paternity leave right, it unlocks a lot of doors for wider society. So the lesson here for ethical storytelling really is that you don't have, when you don't have the expertise, find someone who does. Find the campaign group, that organization that has the knowledge, the policy chops, that knows their stuff. Sometimes, like the long COVID story, I had to be the one who told the story, interwoven with the people who had lived experience, because they all had limited capacity to deliver because of the nature of their illness. In this case, I set the opportunity up to hear from George, but he was in the driving seat. He was the expert. Sometimes you are the vessel of the story, sometimes you are not. Find someone who can tell the story from a human viewpoint, but also someone, ideally the same person, who's able to identify the problem, identify the solution, and offer a call to action. Now, the final story, the example I want to give, is Curly's War. From a young age, I dreamed of turning my grandfather's book, Curly's War, into something I could share with a wider audience. My grandfather, Walter George Blaser, known to his friends in the Marines as Curly, between the 2nd of December 2025 and January 2026, I released a miniseries based on my grandfather's self-published book, Curly's War. Now, the book details his life during World War II, when he served as a Royal Marine and then as a commando, and it involved various missions, including the Atlantic convoys, D-Day, and the liberation of the Netherlands. Rereading the book, planning the episodes with my co-host Emily, who I really have to thank for putting in the hours and helping me deliver this mini-series. Talking to my family about the project and the past gave me a new perspective on my grandfather, and it really rekindled my admiration for him. It reminded me how much I miss him. And it reopened a big container of regret for not asking him more questions. I regret not telling his story while he was still alive, not recording interviews with him. I've no recording of what he sounded like, the inflections of his voice, but I can still hear him when I close my eyes. And as time passes, there are fewer and fewer phrases I can recall. But the most memorable is now young Tom. Not long before he died, perhaps 2 months before he passed, my family and I stopped by my grandparents on the way back to Dover. Granddad was very tired and confused, and I knelt down beside him whilst he was sat down, and a twinkle returned to his eyes. And he said to me, "How are you, young Tom?" Holding back the tears, I said something like, I'm better for seeing you." Making Curly's War is my dedication to him as an act of remembrance. And many years ago, at my Sunday writing group, who Bryony and some of the others attended this talk when it was delivered in person, composed a piece where I imagined myself arriving back at the Rookery, my maternal grandparents' home in the Midlands. The Rookery sat away from a busy main road in Appleby Parva, a hamlet of houses and a pub. And to get to the Rookery, you went down a lane, opened the gate, and walked or drove through the spinney and out into the open. Granddad's workshop to your right, a row of evergreens to your left. Ahead, the 300-plus-year-old house. A driveway encircled the house, a garden encircled the driveway, and a line of trees served as the perimeter. And in my piece, I imagined walking down to the house to find both sets of my grandparents sitting on the lawn having a picnic. They were younger versions of themselves. My 2 grandfathers, the 2 Walters, Blaser and Spare, and my grandmothers, their wives, Margaret and Ida. And they'd been in one another's lives for many years. My parents had married young, divorced, and 20 years later had gotten back, and I was born. And in that piece of writing, my grandparents were all in their 20s and 30s, and I asked them about their plans for where they would go for the future, and what they hoped to do, whether they were happy with their lives, whether they had any regrets, questions I had not had the inclination to ask. There's a song from the musical Camelot that I've been thinking about a lot lately that links to that piece that I wrote about my grandparents. And I use it to close the final episode of Curly's War. Each evening, from December to December, before you drift to sleep upon your cot, Think back on all the tales that you remember of Camelot. Ask every person if he's heard the story and tell it strong and clear if he has not, that once there was a fleeting wisp of glory called Camelot, where once it never rained till after sundown. By 8 a.m. the morning fog had flown. Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot, for one brief shining moment, that was known as Camelot. The rookery, my grandparents' house, was our Camelot. Curly's War was my attempt to preserve my grandfather's story, to tell it strong and clear, as the song says. The past, has a funny way of catching up with you. Sometimes it's a teacher, sometimes it's a trawler, dredging up old feelings. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it's a communion, a chance to sit with the past, to be grateful for it, and to carry it forward. My maternal grandfather passed 13 years ago, my grandmother 9. My paternal grandfather has been gone for 34 years, and his wife, my grandmother, is 98. Their lives, their truths, and the stories they told are with us now. We are the keepers, the generations that have followed. And that's what a communion with the past really means. It's not about going back, it's about moving forward, hand in hand with the past, for the people who have passed, for they stay as our guides. Curly's War was a very different project to living with long COVID and paternity leave. And I had a different responsibility as a son, as a nephew, as a brother, as a cousin, as a grandson, holding my grandfather's legacy up to the world. So that was a big thing to carry. And I brought Emily in, who, as I said, attended the event where we recorded this. And I had a bona fide historian with me. I had someone who could help carry the research with me, someone who could get a different perspective from. And we approached this project knowing that my grandfather's book was written many years after the events of World War II. My grandmother herself said that in her own life that she was an unreliable historian. Granddad was a really good storyteller. What blemishes would you add to your own story 50, 60 years later? So Emily and I decided that we would take sections of my grandfather's book and we would align those sections with facts, with context, to enrich my grandfather's storytelling. And we were upfront, these were Granddad's words. He wasn't there to defend them anymore. So Curly's War was a really good lesson for me. How do you tell a story of a real person who lived, who wasn't famous, and the place of that person's story, in that context, in their context? And I felt we did a really good job with that. I do want to again thank Emily for helping me make Curly's War possible, because it wouldn't be possible without her. So, what makes a good story? Based on what I've been talking about so far, it's this: a good story starts with why me, not just why this story, but why am I the person to tell it? Long COVID, a proximity. I had a proximity and privilege. Paternity leave, I had the personal motivation, and I knew my limits to how to tell that story, so I brought in other people. Curly's War, I was the custodian. In each case, the story chose me as much as I chose it. And if not me, who else? In the case of paternity leave episode, George Gabriel was, far better qualified to tell the paternity leave story, as were the long haulers. A good story serves someone other than yourself. The 12 long haulers, Paul, and Lucy, and little Otis, my grandfather. Every good story I've made has been an act of service to people who couldn't tell it themselves, or couldn't tell it as well, or needed someone with a platform to amplify it. A good story doesn't need to reach everyone to matter. The paternity leave episode went everywhere. Curly's War, was far more personal. Both count. And recently, I had this interaction with someone that reached out to me on Substack. And they said to me, I was talking about your grandfather to my father, and he mentioned that your grandfather wrote a book called Curly's War. So I Googled it and I found your podcast, and I've listened to your episodes. We want to know if the book's going to be published or whether it's available to read. And that, to me, was like the perfect summation of why I did it, is that it had to reach the people that mattered. And I think we live in an age where we have to get everything right all the time, and we have to make the big numbers for it to count. But to reach people that care is far more important than to reach people just for the sake of it. That's what I tell myself anyway. So a good story doesn't need to reach everyone to matter. A good story leaves something behind. The rookery can't be recovered physically. Not long after my grandmother died, the house was bought and it was demolished. And so we are left with the ruins and the memories, and that's a real legacy there to hold. That's what stories do. They preserve what would have otherwise been lost. One thing to note, which is really important, is there's 4 questions to ask when structuring a story that you want to tell. The big part is feeling, right? How do you want your listener, your reader, your viewer to feel when they finished engaging with your work, your project, your story? You want them to think. What should they know or believe? Do. What action should they take next? And so what? Why should your reader care? A successful creative vocation requires you to be true to yourself and your values. And if you're a podcaster, or a storyteller, if you're interested in journalism, it's very easy to make noise, to push the envelope, to chase the clickbait. But if you go down that road, be careful not to lose yourself. Making good trouble means staying true to ethical storytelling. And I often think about a quote by John Lewis, the great civil rights activist and politician, who campaigned alongside Dr. King in the civil rights movement, and then became a very distinguished member of the House of Representatives for Georgia, for his home state. I was on holiday in the United States, and I was doing a tour of various cities, and I was in New Orleans, and I turned a corner, and there was this picture, this sort of poster of John Lewis, behind him members of the police force, to contrast the two. And there was this quote on the poster from John Lewis: "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a month, or a year. It's the struggle of a lifetime. Never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." You have a platform, you have a voice, you have stories that no one else can tell. Use them well, use them honestly, and make some good trouble. That's all I've really got today. I hope you found that useful. It's been great returning to this, to relive the event on the 16th of July. I'm hopeful in the future that we get to do some more stuff in person. It's a very different beast, connecting with folks in person for events generally, but particularly for podcasting. And if you haven't listened to it, we've got the recording that I did with Harriet on the 16th of July, my guest for Spur of Thought, looking at the link between breathing and the menstrual cycle, which is really insightful. I'm very pleased that we were able to do that, and Harriet was very generous to come and visit. So you can go back and listen to that and any episodes, wherever you found this podcast. You can listen to us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, on Podbean, and on YouTube as well, which I've uploaded on here for the video version. That's all from me today. As I said, be back in the autumn for a few episodes, a little bit of a different format. I've got a co-host as well, who I've worked with previously, Leo. We did an episode together on the Windrush generation. Thank you for listening today. The music is by Afro Cluster, Magugu, and Asha Jane, called Young Shall Grow. All rights reserved to those folks. And thank you for giving me permission to play the song. Spur of Thought is a Be the Change Media Network production. This episode was written, edited, and produced by me, Tom Spare. Thanks for listening.
Whether you like them or not, young shall grow. Better fill them with love. Them to know. In this life you don't give up, even when you know. If you fall, get back up. Young shall grow. Whether you like them or not, young shall